So welcome everyone to the community gathering. I'm Elizabeth Ketzel. I'm going to try and turn off the chime. And I will turn this over to Rachel Robasciotti to give an introduction.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see some of your faces and know that we have a lot more people listening in. As Elizabeth said, I'm Rachel Robasciotti, the founder and CEO of Robasciotti and Philipson, and the co-founder of our impact investing strategy, RISE, which stands for Return on Investment and Social Equity. I am here with our social justice strategist, Renee Morgan, and my co-founder, Maya Philipson. She can say hello, and we may be visited upon by our office cat as well during this session. This is time for us to come together around the civil uprising that is occurring around the systemic racial inequities and injustice that have occurred for centuries in our country and really seem to be coming to a head right now. And so this is a time for us to both be in community together, and it's also a time for us to take questions and give some answers about the recent racial justice exclusion list that we published. Just to give you a bit of background, Friday of last week, we released a blog post entitled Stop Funding Systemic Racism, This List Can Help. And it's had tremendous interest from the media and also from folks within our community. We released it because it's work we're already doing and that we've been doing to exclude these companies from our portfolio and organize other investors around doing similar work. But so far, it seems that none in our industry on the investment management side, so not necessarily on the social justice side, but on the investment management side, has really kind of come out and published an exclusion list that makes it very easy and accessible for all the stakeholders of these corporations, be they investors, workers, or consumers, to take action here. And it felt like it was time, regardless of it being considered technically our intellectual property. We actually felt that making change was a lot more important than keeping that specific information to ourselves and solely implemented in our portfolio. It became very important for us to broadly share that across the industry and across our broader network of people who care about change. So that is why we are here. And the format that we'll take is, there have been so many questions that have come up about us publishing the list that it seems like it would be really helpful to answer some of those questions and just be in dialogue with all of you. If you have a question and you can turn your video on, that would be great so that we could actually see you and be in dialogue. And we'll do our best to answer and give you the real answers about how we created the list and own where that list is still has room to evolve, because we anticipate we will be adding to it over time, and it will be a living list that's in deep partnership with movements for social justice by and for impacted communities. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here.
I just want to say as well, if you aren't in a place where you can unmute yourself or you feel more comfortable chatting your questions, feel free to chat them either to the group or to me privately in the chat. So I want to start, and like I said, I'm Elizabeth Ketzel. I'm the Chief of Staff at RNP, and I'll just be helping facilitate the questions. And I would love to start with a question about what the actual reasons for exclusion are on the list, and give some background about what they are and why we include them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually took some questions ahead of time. Thank you, Elizabeth, for kind of curating them and organizing them in a way that we can be most efficient in answering them. I'd like to refer first to Renee for answering that question, because it was Renee and Fong Long, our investment strategist, that worked together primarily to put the list together.
Yep. So I want to back into the question a little bit, just sorry, I was managing the waiting room too. So to say, I think a lot of you on the call have been investing with us or part of our community for a long time, but for anybody that's new, our strategy overall is about divestment, that we believe that there are systemic issues that, like, systemically in America, there are races, there are systems that are racist, and it manifests deeply in certain industries, and so we divest fully from the system. And the reason I'm saying that is a lot of the industry does something called best in class, where they pick an industry and they pick the best company out of this industry, or like the least bad. And so we don't do that. We divest from the entire industry and the system itself, because we don't believe that there's a way to reform it to make it good, or we don't believe that there's no fixing these portions. And it's a way to leverage that message with our social justice partners to amplify that point. So when you look at the list, and Elizabeth, are you going to pull up the list, or do you want me to go through the categories? What was the?
Yeah, I think just giving a really quick overview of the categories and why they show up here. Yeah.
Yep. So one I just mentioned is private prison and prison involvement. So it's the supply chain to the private prison system. My example I was using, just for example, although I can talk about all of them, is Aramark. And so Aramark, on the surface, they're actually a gigantic food supplier. So if you've ever, like at amusement parks, museums, a lot of sports coliseums use Aramark. They're an institutional food company. But they also supply food to many of the prisons, and not just private prisons, like some the public prisons as well. But the food that they're serving those incarcerated is, frankly, it's literally trash. Like, the meat is not the same grade that they serve to the amusement parks. They were violated for serving rocks. There was rocks in the food. It was expired food. And so even the entire state of Michigan canceled their contract. The state of Tennessee is on the verge of canceling the contract. So when you look at the supply chains for the prisons, there are specific companies and specific reasons for that. And then things like mental health services are not excluded, because we believe that if people are incarcerated, they should have access to mental and physical health services. So there are reasons why some of those companies that say prison involvement are on there. And then there's any company that's involved in the private prison system. So if they're supporting the private prisons, they're excluded. And then there are some companies on there that are also in public prisons and are excluded for reasons like Aramark.
And at the very biggest picture, what we're covering here in this first pass at the racial justice exclusion list is, as Renee's saying, prison involvement, immigrant detention. There are an unfortunate number of companies that are involved in both. Money bail, surveillance. Some are also involved in surveillance and immigrant detention. It's a very interesting web, the industry around profiting off of mass incarceration. It's all a web, and you can see that with some of these overlaps. For-profit colleges and occupied territories is kind of the big umbrella. And what Renee is referring to, just to start off, because it's the one that people really want the most information about, is private prison involvement, and why, if a company isn't a private prison but is involved significantly with private prisons doing their work, why they might be removed from the list. And she just gave a really wonderful example about Aramark for any of those that just recently joined. I saw we had some new folks join.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention the overlap, because you'll see immigrant detention on some of them and prisons. An interesting statistic for those that may not know is, even though private prisons are about 10% of the prisons in the United States, and Geo and Core Civic are the two main companies, you'll see those names quite a bit, it's 75 to 80% of the immigrant detention centers. So where they couldn't profit in the private prisons because they came under fire, frankly, and the feds started canceling their contracts and states started canceling the contracts, They just moved to the immigration detention centers. So you'll see a lot of those companies that are, like Rachel said, that are overlapped because it's the same business profiting off incarceration.
One of the questions we just got that we also got kind of ahead of time that I think using an example like private prison involvement and a company like Airmark or a company involved in the system really addresses is, while we may be clear on why private prisons is an issue, what is kind of our theory behind calling for divestment from these companies that are involved versus some groups who are more involved in shareholder activism? And what's a way to use the tool of divestment, in particular a public list, to maybe simultaneously apply pressure to those companies that might have lots of different contracts? Private prisons is not the only thing Airmark does, right? So
Yep.
How do we speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So, or Rachel, do you want?
Well, I just want to say a quick thing, and I know you have so much to share where this is concerned. I was speaking to a reporter this morning, and I was asked a question about that specifically, and I just want to dispel the myth that divestment doesn't work. Divestment doesn't work when you do it in your own portfolio and you do it in a private way. What has failed us inside of the investment industry since apartheid is not coming together, not organizing investors, and not moving in solidarity. When we move in solidarity, that impacts share prices, that sends a message to those who are in leadership, and those who are in leadership particularly care about share prices because that's how they're primarily compensated on the board of directors and in the C-suite. So there's this myth going on that divestment doesn't really work. And the truth of the matter is that divestment hasn't been very effective because we haven't been using it outside of private portfolios, and we haven't actually been organizing other investors in order to make it truly effective. And that is changing now.
Yeah. And so I've worked for companies that do shareholder advocacy. So I am a believer in all methods. You know, I believe that there's a place for shareholder advocacy, and especially if you target the leader of a certain industry, you can potentially impact change. But I believe that, so like that's true. And what I can also say is two things. One is some of the foundations and the people doing shareholder advocacy are struggling right now with companies that say, yes, we'll make the change, and then they don't. And so you can get a proxy vote and you can get the company to sign on to what you want the change to be, but the follow through to make sure the company does it becomes far more challenging. I also think there's a huge place to say, you know what, no. Like, this is systemically so egregious, so racist, so sexist, whatever the thing is, that it doesn't have a place. Like, there is no way to fix private prisons. Like, reform is not a thing that is going to fix this this part of a broken system. That there are places within these broken systems that you have to draw a line and say no. And like Rachel said, if you do that with critical mass and you have social justice people on the ground targeting this thing, and then we say as investors, this is wrong. Like, this is just not something that anybody should be making a profit from, that has power. And so it's a line in the sand. That's not to take away from shareholder advocacy coming at it from a different direction. This is a huge broken system that is going to take every single means necessary to change. And so this is the method that we're using.
Absolutely.
I think one important context that is helpful for a lot of the questions is where did the criteria come from? Not necessarily specifically by each criteria, but to specify whether that's something that we generated internally or whether that's something that actually came from the communities that we're talking to, and kind of explaining how we chose that, how we choose our criteria in general.
I think that this is an important hallmark for looking at divestment. I just want to back up a moment before I answer that question and say that when defunding and divestment are called upon in, like, as one group is doing it or in a small way, they can be ignored. But as we've seen with the recent uprising and protests, when it's called on in a very large way and in solidarity and consistently, it can have massive and frequently quite immediate impacts. So I just want to make sure that I clarify that as well. This is not the tool is an excellent tool if it's used correctly and if people are willing to do what it takes and step away from the private profit that one investment manager may make and really put that data out into the public for change. Elizabeth, will you just quickly remind me of what your question was? It was related, but I get so impassioned sometimes talking that I forget where I'm going.
Yeah, I was saying, I think it's an important context for so many of the questions that we're getting and for the work that we're doing to hear about how we actually choose our racial justice criteria and how we determine that private prisons, something like private prisons is in a place where we think we need to pull out from it completely. Where does that who does that line get drawn by? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we actually have received a lot of questions where that's concerned. The most important thing to know is that we are following the lead of social justice movements that are by and for the impacted communities. So we're following the lead of the Movement for Black Lives, Color of Change, the types of organizations that are really focusing on these issues and have been on the ground working directly in these impacted communities. And we're looking to them for leadership. And we're taking the power that we have as investors and in a certain sense, really placing it in their hands and amplifying their voice within the investment world. And you can see that if you take a look at the blog post that I just put in the chat, you can actually see that in our end notes around the reason for exclusion, you can see directly why each one of those is a reason for exclusion, not in our own words, but in the words of the various organizations that we're paying attention to. And you can also see where there's a specific data source as well in that list. So it should be entirely auditable, but always leading you back to impacted communities.
Also, I didn't get, we talked quite a bit about the private prisons and how that related to immigration detention, money bail. I can run through really quickly the last three. Surveillance also ties into the prison industrial complex. What I sort of call incarceration 2.0 is basically as we do decarcerate, and I do think that mass incarceration is going to unravel a bit because of public pressure. But what is happening is what I'm calling like sort of incarceration 2.0 is that people are just being incarcerated in their homes. So this is like ankle monitoring, reporting to halfway houses. It's a version of incarceration that isn't actually in prison. And so surveillance is a huge part of that. And so the companies that we excluded that are on they're not all the surveillance companies, they're the surveillance companies that are developing technologies for this like incarceration 2.0, the ankle monitoring companies, that type of surveillance. An interesting point about that is this is a living I'm going to make this point because this is a living document. This is not the end all be all list. Like I actually hope to double and triple it as we sort of really get clear about which companies, what are really racist practices? Like what is, and I'm going to use the example of facial recognition. We talked about facial recognition in-house, the investing criteria team. And right now we have not excluded every facial recognition company, but we have them kind of on a list, and we're having an ongoing conversation is facial recognition racist? Is it inherently racist? We know it's used in racist ways, but when you look at your phone and open your phone, is that a company that we want to exclude? We might, and the answer is we might. Like that's what I'm saying. It's a living list. We haven't kind of made that call yet. I'm kind of leaning on a heavy maybe yes, but there are areas like that we're going to be like diving deeper. So I think it's an interesting, and there are areas that we're going to be seeing more and more of through a racial justice lens, which I think is really, really good. Because it hasn't been used necessarily in any kind of wide way, except for like companies like us that are looking at it through that lens. So I just wanted to throw that example out to let you know that this is a work in progress, and we are going to be like, it's front and center for us. And we're already looking at these different ways that we can improve and refine this list. Like colleges should be public or nonprofit. They shouldn't be beholden to shareholders. Occupied territories, I think you probably all are familiar with that, and probably one of our more controversial screens. And Rachel, do you want to speak more to that, because you all had community meetings about that before me?
I really do, and I would say we're updating the website also to in that endnote section that talks about why occupied territories is an exclusion factor. And to be perfectly clear, there are many important things that are wrong about that occupied territory. There are many things that are problematic about what's happening in that area. And I want to be very clear that we are deeply supportive of Jewish people in our community and also worldwide. We think it's a very complex situation that is happening in the West Bank. And that being said, even with our numerous connections and deep community ties to the Jewish people in our own community and beyond, it still feels important to recognize when systemic racism is at work anywhere in the world, and to really call that out and to stand in solidarity where that's concerned. So we received a lot of questions about that. Does anyone have any follow-up questions about that? None so far. You can also ask them later. Great. Elizabeth, what were some of the other questions that we received ahead of time?
Yeah, I think a really interesting question is that came through is about the potential of maybe an anti racial exclusion list, or in the future, what would it look like to have a list of companies that maybe aren't just neutral, but companies that are actively putting in the work to really improve, and as a way of putting pressure on other companies, like promoting and those who are setting an example. Is that something that we would look forward to in the future?
Yes, please.
Yeah, right. I know. I would love that. That is something that we are certainly on the lookout for. Systemic racism is at such a state in our country that I look at it like it is like if our country is an ailing patient, we have to put a tourniquet on to stop the bleeding. We really need to end the systemically racist practices that are happening, and the companies that are participating in that system need to be held to account for how they're participating in that system. And really, I feel like doing those positive things is absolutely necessary, but I do liken it to like really good nutrition. It can take a long time for that to work its way through the economy. That needs to be happening now. Just like the ailing patient, you want to make sure they're getting really good nutrition, but it's actually important in this moment to put the tourniquet on to stop the systemic racism. And so that's why that's our focus now. We are in the middle of looking very deeply with partners of ours working directly in Black communities across the country about ways to more directly support those communities, and looking for ways that we can leverage our power within financial markets to directly support those communities. So definitely stay tuned for that. So that is something that we are definitely constantly looking at.
Yeah, I want to live in a world where like that's like a thing that we can look towards. I mean, right now there's not even a criteria that we could come up with for because publicly traded companies are the larger companies in America. So like there's no company that's like doing spectacular things to stop systemic racism.
And I feel very strongly that there are many for-profit companies that are centering this. We are one of them. There are many companies that are operating as regenerative companies, like part of the regenerative and solidarity economy in many ways. And the trouble is that they don't rise to the size of publicly traded companies, or at least not yet. And so if we're dealing with where most of the power and therefore most of the capital is concentrated, it's in the publicly traded market. And we need to end these systemically racist practices as we're moving forward solutions that really support racial justice and equality.
I can give you one example that, just FYI, is Home Depot the CEO has said he's going to give 90% of his profits and wealth to the Trump campaign, and Lowe's has committed, I want to say 250 million, I think it's 250 million to communities of color to develop small businesses. So, you have a choice as to where you buy your lumber.
And I think
Very
that
true.
brings us to a question that is also critical to the work that we do that came in ahead of time. That said, in a social, racial, environmental justice context, can you speak to pros and cons of staying invested in the stock market versus divesting altogether? And I think that's something you kind of were starting to talk about, Rachel, in terms of like the impact of why we work with publicly traded companies.
My heartfelt response to that is, if you are in a position and you can move your money out of the financial markets, and if you're in a position where you don't need statements and you don't need liquidity or access to the funds, and you really can contribute directly to communities and directly to businesses by and for impacted communities, please do that. We have so many friends and resources that we can refer you to. So you're not going to get any argument here. In fact, we're actually going to encourage you to do that. For our folks who have those needs or want to specifically make change inside of the financial markets, from a very practical standpoint, that's where power is concentrated right now. And so those who have money in those places of power, like how can we take bold actions in solidarity with these communities and in favor of justice, that's the work that we're doing. So I really kind of I really am saying, like, yes, invest, if you can, we encourage you to really move toward investing directly in the regenerative economy. And if you either cannot, or you want to keep a foot firmly planted in what you can do that's bold inside of where power is concentrated in the capital markets, then we're your bridge for doing that.
Thanks, Rachel. Another question that we got is something that I think we as a team talk about a lot. And so I'm glad that it came up, which is how do we think about the intersection of race and the environment? A question came in that it's hard to separate egregious environmental degradation from egregious social justice. Do you have your attention on companies that are doing great harm to the environment as well? And I know the two of you can speak a little bit to our environmental justice work, but also how we've been thinking about how it intersects with some of our other topic focuses.
Absolutely. We have, I'm going to put in the chat now the link to the work that we continue to do, that we've been doing for over a year now, about investing at the intersection of racial justice and climate change. We continue to do this work. We most recently did a presentation to a multi-billion-dollar racial justice investing coalition that Renee had a hand in starting. That's even probably modest. I mean, Renee mostly started the Racial Justice Investing Coalition, and we were presenting to them directly about why climate justice is racial justice. So we've put that article in the chat. Please check it out. The area of focus there is on divesting from the most harmful portions of the industrial agriculture system. So that's our focus, based on our work with Gopal Dayanini and ETC Group, Movement Generation, and also talking to several local folks also that are part of our community.
Yeah, and one thing I will say, a question came in about whether those companies are on this list. I think that's a really good question as to why this list has to be dynamic. And it's something we've talked about in terms of how we categorize those groups and how they intersect. And it's a good point in that this isn't one and done work anymore for us any more than it should be for all of us intending to use this list or use these kinds of screens, that the conversations are ongoing with our social justice partners on what the most effective lever for change is. So that means how we represent that data is going to continue to be dynamic. And I think that really, I think that's something we're really thinking about is how we present those categories.
Yeah, part of what we are understanding is that our work around racial and climate justice, we are at the visionaries and activists tend to be at the early stages of working on particular issues, and the media kind of comes, which is a wonderful thing, can come in behind us and really kind of do the work of making those types of things more evident. I think that the media is just starting to get a sense of the fact that those two things are interrelated. I'm just now starting to get questions from media folks about that. And what we want to do is very deeply ally and beyond being an ally, but partner with the social justice organizations. And so what we're doing is a lot of capacity building within those organizations to make the data that they have available to the rest of the world. And also a lot of that data, just because it takes pure like computing capacity and human capacity to create a complete data set that could actually be used by investors, workers, consumers, the data sets aren't complete yet. And we're doing extensive work to support making those data sets complete so that that type of information can be added. What we're working with on the racial justice exclusion list is specifically whole data sets that we have. There are some additional screens around Indigenous peoples, and there's also some additional occupied territories that we're adding to the list. But again, we really want to make sure that that is the most up-to-date list. And in ensuring that those are the most up-to-date, we frequently have to just, you know, do work to support a full list coming forward so that we can use it in our portfolio and in ways like this, make it public.
Yeah, I want to speak to that because I see the question, AD. I think you're still on the call, about including Indigenous land in our occupied territories. So that's a yes. Like Rachel said, we're working on it. We do have an Indigenous screen, but I actually will ask the community this. We have Indigenous led partners. And actually, I'm going to talk to one of them about some of this in the next couple weeks. But also, if any of you know a list specifically, because our speaking to your comment here, our portfolios are fossil fuel free, so we aren't invested in the pipelines and companies that you're directly, you know, referring to here. We divest in general out of those, but it's an interesting question, and frankly I don't know the answer to some of the other publicly traded companies that are infringing and exploiting some of the Indigenous or Turtle Island reservation lands in the US. So if any of you do know of those lists or data sources, and I will be speaking to our partners as well, I'd love to hear about it.
Yes, please. We are a community. Please. Yeah, bring forward your contacts with social justice organizations and especially researched and well-maintained lists. We're always looking for those and looking to make sure those get amplified so that they aren't just being used in our portfolios, they're being used in others. I can see that we have a little over 15 minutes left, and there's been a big question that's come up that lots of people have asked about Schwab, and I want to make sure that we respond to it directly and that we are also able to be in conversation about how our response to it is landing. That feels really important. So one of the things that you may notice if you're looking at that list is that Charles Schwab is on that list. And Charles Schwab is the custodian for many of our clients. So it's literally the place that prints the statements, and when trades are placed, that's actually where the trades are made. And in fact, we have clients who will be receiving a letter letting them know that their accounts are at another small custodian that has been purchased by Goldman Sachs. And for reasons of values alignment, we are moving them from that custodian over to Schwab. And there's been several questions that have come up, and some of them raised in really beautiful ways about, hey, wait a minute, our accounts are at Schwab. How can you have Schwab on the list? So I just want to make sure that we're really clear about that. And I would start by, Maya, I'd love for you to just start by giving us some context about, and Renee, you should probably say how Schwab got on the list once Maya gives us context about the different divisions of Schwab. And then I can fill in kind of like why we put them on the list anyway.
Absolutely. So Schwab is what's called a custodian, which means that they make the majority of their money by holding investment accounts. But like all good multinational corporations who have profit and growth as their main motive, they try to do as many things as possible. So Schwab has a main division that is, again, a custodian, which is where our client accounts are held. They have a small division that's a bank, and they have a medium-sized division that actually sponsors and creates mutual funds, ETFs, and other types of pooled investment products. That division that creates those funds is legally separate and has to be from its main function as a custodian, which is the arm that we use, but it's all under the Schwab umbrella. Is that what you were looking for, Rachel?
Yes, yeah, just like that general understanding. And then Renee, can you talk about in our research how they specifically got on the list and what their standing is?
Yeah, sure. So Enlace International is a social justice group that works with racial and economic justice. And they've been, you may have also heard of them as Freedom to Thrive. They did a name change. So Enlace International or Freedom to Thrive. And they work specifically with racial and economic justice. And so one of their campaigns has been prison divestment for many years. And their criteria is targeting any banks that invest in the private prisons that hold more than 1 million shares. So we're talking about the biggest investors in private prisons. And that ranges anywhere from about 30 to 40 different companies on any given month. And so these big banks, when you see the big banks on our list, almost, well, exclusively, all of them are because they hold over 1 million shares. BlackRock owns a ton, like 4 million or 5 million shares or something. Schwab owns 1.2 million shares of private prisons in their mutual funds. And
yeah, go ahead, please, Renee.
No, so I mean, it's just our criteria. They crossed our threshold.
It's our criteria, and that criteria was really set by our social justice partners. So it's really, for us, when we saw that, we felt uncomfortable, just to be perfectly honest. But there was never a question that we would publish their name, add them to the list, and we, in both in integrity and in active protest, there are fewer custodians than one might imagine in the investment industry that can actually hold the types of accounts that we have investment advisory agreements with our clients on. And sadly, Schwab is one of the most values aligned. I say sadly because they're ending up in a certain sense on this list. But that doesn't mean that we're letting them off the hook, and we are already actively engaging with them. And we're working with other registered investment advisors that we know to apply pressure, even if it's coming from a wholly separate division, to Schwab to eliminate their investment in private prisons. We're moving forward with a message that should ring clear as a bell that there's no passive investing in private prisons. There's no such thing as truly neutral passive investing. All investing has a viewpoint. And I think it's really important that we see that, even if we're passively investing based on an index, who created that list of companies that was on the index? And what is their stance around these particular issues? Those are things that we really need to take a look at.
Yeah, can I add something, Rachel?
Please.
So I wanna also touch on something that you said. which is that we felt very uncomfortable. And I want to remind all of us here on this call of something that you have said to me many times, and that I think is also really important for my fellow white people to hear, is that uncomfortable is not the same thing as unsafe. And so it made us very uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that we should back away from it. It actually means that we should stand in that uncomfortability and decide what statement we want to make there. So I wanted to say that. So thank you for giving me that space. The second thing I wanted to highlight is something that you mentioned, which is that large holders in these prison companies is because they are creating products, and those products look out at the entire market, and these prison companies are parts of the economic system, and so they are, according to them, simply purchasing those shares to have a representative stake in the economic market. And that is something that we profoundly disagree with, because we do not only believe that these companies should not exist, you should not profit off of the incarceration of human beings, but that there are enough investments in the world that you can actually take a stand and not invest in certain things. And so, as Rachel said, we're going to try to bring that perspective to some of these larger mutual fund companies, and we're going to fight the good fight.
And I mean, truly, the number of custodians that can hold our clients' accounts are so few. I sometimes think about them like countries. So it actually is hugely involved to pick up and move from one country to another. Not only that, there are only so many countries in the world. So what we do as citizens when we're stuck in a situation like that is that we rise up and we lift up our voice and we say, hey, you wouldn't exist if you didn't have our business. So you need to listen to what's important to us and our clients.
I mean, we're like all the investors, right? Like we're working within an imperfect system and have to make choices. I do want to touch on two questions because I know we're wrapping up and people have asked. So Emily, I want to address defund versus divest. There is a huge, as probably all of you know, the movement for Black Lives and many other social justice groups are asking citizens and community members to defund from the police. So we highly encourage that. Go to your city council meetings, like work to defund the police. That is really different than divestment. Defund is, I mean, and I don't want to take up a lot of time with this, but as you all probably have read and know, 1/3 of most city budgets go to the police, and they have like taken over animal control. They've taken over a lot of different systems within a city that have now become under the police purview. And the problem with that is that if it's under the police purview, criminalization is what police do. So it's criminalizing a lot of different parts of the city. So the defunding is like, it's got many layers, but it's pulling out those, it's defunding different services. In divestment, we're not talking about defunding. We're actually saying we are not going to participate in this system at all. Like in the investment world, I would think of defunding as like reform, and it's kind of what I was like speaking to at the beginning. We're drawing a line and saying there is no good surveillance going to law enforcement. There is no good private prison system. There is no good for-profit college. So like we aren't investing at all. It's not even like, I think one of your questions was like, no more funding. We're like none. We don't have any, we're not going to have any, and we're not going to invest. So we're saying that whole industry and system is just bad and we're not going to participate, which is really different than, I mean, not really, but it's different than defunding and reform, which is changing and not giving as much money to a system and really rethinking what policing is and making a lot of changes there. We're saying it has nothing to do with change. This is just a bad thing. It's just bad. Is that helpful?
I think so it's very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one question. And then, oh, there's a couple questions about Trump. So I just want, because there's several, I want to at least just mention this. there are exclusion lists. There are lists out there that of companies that either that have supported Trump, like I mentioned one, Home Depot, that either invest in Trump or the RNC. The issue with that in some ways is that they're not very accurate. They're kind of a moving target and they change. And so we actually had some on the list at some point and then the list wasn't updated. So we don't currently have a Trump exclusion list, if you will. A lot of our companies by what they are.
But what we do have is a list that excludes companies based on disproportionate support for the Republican Party. And so that is public information. And so if they are disproportionately offering financial support to the Republican Party, that kind of indirectly gets at that issue.
Yeah.
And we are constantly looking at more direct ways to get at that issue.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I know like in 2016, that was a huge thing and we had lots of good data. And it's one of those things that like people haven't kept up with. And to actually look at companies' annual filings is a little, anyway. That's sort of the murky short answer is yes, they sort of exist. They're not good enough to like do Trump specific right now, but we have our RNC list. That's clear as mud, huh?
Yes.
I have one outstanding question that came in from a few different people that I think might be able to have like a quick answer in terms of where to direct people. I know several different people have said that the majority of their investments might be in a 401k.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your recommendation for those people where that's their primary means of investing and are interested in divesting from this list?
So you are in a pickle when you are inside of a fund because someone else is choosing what is like what the screens are for that fund, if there are any. And the most important thing that you can do is make your voice known to those folks. One of our partners that we work with to get this type of data out into the world and also for people to understand what's in their retirement plans and sign petitions that go to the investment managers for those funds is Your Stake, which I've put in the chat, yourstake.org. You can sign up there. You can see what's inside of your retirement plan. You can sign petitions specifically about this issue and many others. Really the most important thing, that's on us to a great degree. The more that we are able to organize other investors in this space to understand that impacted communities and the organizations that are by and for those communities are the ones we should be listening to, the more those investors are going to change the data sources, right, that they're looking at, that they're going to look directly to those impacted communities. So you can support us by letting people know about what we're up to. You can support us by talking, if you aren't one of our clients, by talking to your own advisors about this list, because all of that eventually trickles up. As the clients, you have tremendous power in letting them know what you have an appetite for and what you don't. So when you send them this list, they're going to go and look at those data sources, and they're going to find that those are all these social justice organizations we're wanting to lift up. Okay.
Great. Any closing comments, Rachel? We were able to blast through pretty much all the questions.
We did get to a lot of questions. If there's anything that we didn't answer or that you didn't want to put in the chat here, please email us. We'll take in those questions, and if it makes sense, we'll have another one of these calls. We'll have a recording of this call that will go out in a few weeks. Everything in our industry needs to go through a regulatory compliance process. I guess one final note that I would make is that we've used the term racist quite a bit, and that term can be quite incendiary. I want to comment on it because there are racist systems, and we can have outrage and we can take action against those racist systems. And it's very important that in the process we're giving people and the companies that are not inherently racist, like private prison companies, in a certain sense, that we're giving companies and individuals an opportunity to change. And if that particular language that's incendiary and that people have become so reactive to is what we lead with, that is not always the most effective route. So this is definitely a conversation for folks that are within our community. But as we go out there and spread the word, I hope you noticed in the blog post, we were really thoughtful about talking about ending systemic racism, because we want to be bold, but we also want to get our message across. So I just want to kind of end on that note about using the term racist and amplifying the message as we ask you all to do. So thank you very much for joining us. Elizabeth, you did a fantastic job of facilitating. Renee, thank you for being a wealth of information, and Maya for being my co-founder, and the other person that's leading the Schwab organizing work. We put our email address in the chat. We love to hear from you. Let us know if there's anything else that you want us to have community conversations about. We want to stay in contact with you, and we want that communication to go both ways. So we're signing off.
Oh, I was gonna say, you should have all received an email from me this morning with the reminder. So feel free to just respond to me directly through that email if you have outstanding questions.
Yes, please do. And make sure you take good care of yourself. To those of us who let this issue deeply impact us and who have personal connections to it, it can be quite a bit to take in. So please take care of yourselves, and let's keep moving toward racial justice.